Welcome to the fifth monthly Mind Matters Speaker Series, and please continue to get breakfast and eat, and um, while I make a few introductory remarks. I'm Paul Dillon. I'm a former Army Reserve First Lieutenant and a Vietnam warrior, and I'm a member. It was 46 years ago in a waistline ago uh, when I was a lean, mean, green fighting machine. Actually, I was. Uh, those days have long passed. And I'm a member of the Kennedy Forum Leadership Council. And for those of you who are new to the Kennedy Forum, we're a leadership initiative working to eliminate the stigma and discrimination against people with mental health and addiction challenges. We're also working to improve access to care and the system of care itself. We're incredibly lucky today to have our founder of the Kennedy Forum, Congressman Patrick Kennedy, with us for this discussion. It's an honor to have him back in Chicago and in town and with us here this morning. Many of my fellow board and leadership council members are in the room today. I just want to take a minute to acknowledge them. Board and advisory members include our esteemed chairman, Peter O'Brien, Lindsay Artola, John Atkinson, and Mark Moraz. Our leadership council members include Father Scott Donahue, John Edelman, Judy Irwin, and Steve Moore. And our Mind Matter members and premier members, J. Dollard Carey, an old friend that I reconnected with here this morning, Katina Panagopoulos from Wintrust, Joanne Worden and Claire Reed from Cathedral Consulting, and Ronald Robinson and Susan Simonson from Lydia Healthcare. And I want to thank Victor Legrune, the director of the Chicago Office of Veterans Affairs for the city of Chicago. And we may have, Victor's a veteran, we may have other veterans in the room here this morning. If we do, would you stand and be recognized? Would you? My God, we've got a whole battalion here. This is wonderful. It really is. And have my fellow veterans here. Today we're talking about veterans' mental health. Just a few facts to frame our morning discussion. Less than half of U.S. veterans, I think it's more like a third, actually receive their health care through the VA, either because they don't qualify or they're too far from a facility, or they get their health care through their employer. 1 in 10 veterans relies on Medicaid for their health care, and tragically, veterans are 21% higher risk of suicide than civilians, leading to, its figures well publicized, 20 suicides a day. Even one is too many. And the consequences of losing mental health coverage to this important group in America would be absolutely devastating. I intend to have a lively discussion. We're honored to have Congressman Kennedy and hopefully Patrick Murphy, who will be coming along soon, former congressman and former undersecretary of the Army, and also a very, very dynamic person who's been an honor for me to meet this morning because I followed her organization for years, is Marjorie Morrison, the CEO of the PsychArmor Institute and Psych Hub. Their full bios are in your materials, but I wanted to note just a few things about each of them as they come up to join me. There are a number of things that all these people have in common. Their service to our country, their entrepreneurship, and their commitment to reaching more people through writing and speaking. Patrick Kennedy should need no introduction to any of you, but he served 16 years in Congress, many years in the Rhode Island State Legislature. Before that, he's our founder. Had a wonderful idea for the Kennedy Forum, as well as a number of other organizations, including One Mind, which is changing how scientists collaborate to study and diagnose and treat brain diseases. And he is also an author, a businessman, frequent media commentator, and absolutely a wonderful friend. Patrick, if you'd come up and join us, please. Marjorie Morrison is the founder and CEO of PsychArmor Institute, which is helping bridge the military-civilian divide, which is extremely wide in this country, particularly here in Chicago, because I found so few veterans are in business leadership positions here in the city. There are very few Vietnam veterans who are, and it's the younger people who haven't had a chance to come up yet. So the military-civilian divide is very wide here in Chicago and needs to be drawn closer together, and this forum is instrumental in doing that. But Marjorie's created and promoting and distributing free online courses covering a wide range of topics important to those who support the military community. Marjorie's focus on supporting members of the military and their communities was first developed in the field after she spent a year writing and implementing revolutionary proactive counseling programs for the Marines, where those of us in the Army will forgive her for that transgression. She was also an author, business person, and media commentator and contributor. And when Undersecretary Murphy comes in, I'll introduce him as well. But Marjorie, would you come up? Thank you. You know, Mr. Kennedy, you've been at the forefront of mental health and addiction issues for many, many years, from co-sponsoring the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act in 2008, doing your 16 years in Congress, to recently serving on the Trump administration's opioid commission. What parallels have you found between veterans and the general public, particularly when it comes to mental health issues?
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for your beautiful introduction and welcoming to everyone here today, and thank you for your kind words about me. Before I answer, I'd like to thank some of our great sponsors and supporters here this morning. Rick Kirchhoff, I want to thank Steve Moore, Kara Cohen, of course, John Atkinson, who helped lead our business initiative, and Mark Ishtok, who does so much with our work at Thresholds, Harry Leiter, who's our friend from Walgreens. Thank you, Harry. And, of course, none other than Peter and Mimi O'Brien, without whom this would not have happened. I get credit for this because it has my family name on it, but truth be told, out here, it ought to be called the O'Brien Forum. because of all that Peter and Mimi have done. So many friends are in this audience. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, so important that they're here because so much of what's driving this discussion is the ultimate tragedy, and that is that we haven't been able to address mental health for our country and our veterans sufficiently when we are seeing such high suicide rates, not only amongst veterans but the general population. It should be a wake-up call for this country. And the only message I have for all of us here this morning is that we're absolutely in denial as a nation. Absolutely, categorically in denial as a nation. You know, you saw that Time magazine issue. President Trump said, no, you know, they might consider me, so I'm going to take myself out as the man of the year. What ought to be the subject of the year is mental health. Truth be told, our political system does not have any insight. I was just testifying yesterday in front of the Senate Appropriations Committee. At the same time, they're considering a tax bill where they can find $1.5 trillion for multinational corporations, transnational corporations. They're not citizens of our country, yet we have no problem giving them hundreds of billions of dollars because of our lowering of the corporate tax code from 35 to 20%, while we've got literally over 100 that we can count Americans dying each year at their own hand, either through suicide or overdose. But it seems to me that both are the same in terms of deaths of despair. And if we cannot wake up to this fact, where we're spending $500 million a year on the biggest public health crisis of our time, whereas when it came to HIV/AIDS, we were spending $24 billion a year. $23,000 per person in this country we're spending on HIV/AIDS. During that crisis, we're spending $113 per capita, per person, dying in the opioid crisis. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And veterans are dying of the opioid crisis, and they're dying of the suicide crisis. And their numbers are particularly jarring. And you say to yourself, if we can't even wake up to our veterans, I mean, taking aside the civilian tragedy, the one thing that should absolutely unite our country and create a bipartisan call for urgent action is our nation's veterans. Period. End of story. Our veterans, number one. Number one. And yet, we can't even get our arms around addressing the crisis for our veterans, even though we know the things that we need to do in order to reduce this crisis, which we're not doing. So it's very timely that, Patrick, you showed up. I was just warming up for you. I will tell you, Paul, you can give Patrick his introduction because you're doing a great job at all these introductions. But the other Patrick, Patrick Murphy, I'll never forget getting my text blowing up saying, "Are you all right? Are you all right? God, you're such a hero. God, we knew you had it in you to be such a courageous person." I'm like, God, where's all these texts coming from? People were all calling me because they thought I was Patrick Murphy. They were all saying great things about me because they thought I was Patrick Murphy. This was about 3 years ago when we had a horrific train crash, as you may recall, in Philadelphia, where the Amtrak train went off the rails. A number of people were killed. Patrick Murphy was one of those terribly injured, but had enough sense to do what he did because he's a soldier. That in spite of his own injuries, he went to take care of other people. And there was a lot of folks who said, that's incredible. But then, of course, like most veterans, even in this circumstance, he said, "Oh, it's no big deal." And that's what I always have found has been the mark of an incredible human being. So,
Mr. Undersecretary, it's great to have you with us this morning.
Thanks, Paul.
For those of you who don't know Congressman Murphy, he served in the first Iraq War. He's the first Iraq War veteran elected to Congress from 2007 to 2011. He also served as the 32nd Undersecretary of the Army in 2005 and served until January 2017. He led the management and operations for the Army. He's an author, businessman, TV news anchor, producer, and more. Truly a Renaissance man.
A friend of Patrick and Marjorie's too. So.
And since you have just joined us, let me ask you, Mr. Undersecretary, you served our country in the Army in the Judge Advocate General's Corps in the 82nd Airborne Division. Airborne all the way.
Airborne.
You like to jump out of airplanes? Unbelievable. It's, I've never known anything.
But I don't like train crashes, so I'm done with that.
Okay, good. You got your Bronze Star for meritorious service in Iraq. Served 4 years in Congress and was Undersecretary and Acting Secretary of the Army under the Obama administration. Mental health issues, invisible wounds, and suicide continue to be a problem for veterans. Through your experience, what do you see are the biggest challenges for veterans when it comes to mental health?
Thanks, Paul. And it really is an honor to be here with all of you this morning and to be with both Patrick Kennedy and Marjorie Morrison, who are truly phenomenal leaders, national leaders in the mental health space. So from my perspective as a veteran, as a combat veteran, is the two signature injuries of the Iraq-Afghanistan wars, which are the longest wars in American history. I think most folks forget that. We're still at war. We're actually doing offensive operations in 9 countries. Last night when we all went to bed, 180,000 of our troops were in over 140 foreign countries. Our troops, American troops. But the two signature injuries of Iraq and Afghanistan are post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury. And for soldiers, the culture of that everything's okay and not to ask for help and kind of the machoism of it has been a disservice in a sense that it has hurt and hindered treatment and trying to change the culture of that mental health is just as important as physical health. I will tell you, I have my undergraduate degree in psychology, and when I came back home, we had lost 19 men in my unit in Baghdad in 2003 and 2004. And I had led this, what's called a BOLT team, and my team of 7 paratroopers, my individual team came home alive, but one of my soldiers never really came home. And we used to talk about Notre Dame football. His name was Sean Scarborough, and he was engaged. And when we came back, both our fiancés had left us when we came home, and he struggled. And I remember when I won and ran for Congress and served, I remember talking to him, and he's back in Oklahoma, and he was in and out of treatment. And I said to him, hey, Sean, why don't you come up and live in Washington? You could live with me and my roommate, who was another congressman. I said, you could work for me. We'll figure this out together, et cetera. And he kept saying, no, I'm good. And he wasn't good. He's no longer with us. And that survivor's guilt of you see people that you know and you love, and you think to yourself, I could have done more, I should have done more, will always haunt me. And that's why, for me, a lot of people look and say, all right, well, when you're in Congress, we did the post 9/11 GI Bill, and we pushed to make sure that Senator Obama was elected to bring the troops home from Iraq. But one of the most proud moments was co-authoring Patrick's bill, which was the mental health parity bill, and really trying to tackle mental health as a nation and really changing the culture. And so on the veteran side, it's not just when you talk about active duty soldiers, but it's those veterans when they come home. We do a phenomenal job in the Army and the military on breaking down people and building them back up to become warriors. We do not do a great of a job when we bring them back home to society. And so in my perch as the COO of the Army last year, I just left a few months ago, was really embedding mental health teams at the brigade level, where they are, where they're doing PT every morning, et cetera. And those embedded brigade health team, we tripled them. But that's just on the active duty side. That's on the active soldier side, the National Guard Reserves. And we have, again, over 1 million soldiers. But that veterans transition piece is just so critically important.
Marjorie, you run the, thank you, Mr. Undersecretary. Marjorie, you run the PsychArmor Institute, an online platform of free resources for veterans to learn how to effectively, resources for Americans to learn how to effectively support veterans. You're not a veteran yourself, and what led you to start this organization? What need did you see? What are you trying to accomplish with PsychArmor? And even more important, how are you going to distinguish what you do from the 40 to 50,000 nonprofit organizations that are out there now to support veterans, which to me, being a Vietnam veteran, is amazing. How we've learned from the awful experience when we came home, when there was nothing, there was nothing. So what led you to do this?
Thank you, Paul. And thanks for Kelly and the Kennedy Forum for having me. It's an honor to be sitting here between my two favorite Honorable Patrick J's. I feel like today we're having an Honorable Patrick J sandwich. So, I'll try to keep up with these two amazing men here. I'm a mental health care provider, and in San Diego, I saw veterans, I saw active duty. I had no experience, and I had no idea that I needed to know anything. And so I was pretty lethal as a therapist, because they would come in and I would have a couple come in, and a woman would say to me, my husband, he's not talking to his commander and telling him that he needs to get home at 5 o'clock to help with dinner and the kids. And I felt like, okay, well, you need to have some assertive training, and you need to speak up and stand up for yourself. And in the military, that's the worst advice that I could give. So I have I could write a whole book about bad advice and counseling that I did, but I had no place to learn. And to the point about the 40,000 nonprofits supporting veterans, there are so many resources, almost too many resources, but yet for the average American, we have 1% of our country serving, about 10% are military connected. So it leaves about 90% of us that don't understand that culture and no place to go to learn. So for me, I felt like it was out of a necessity, and I kind of thought, well, what would I want? I wouldn't go somewhere to do a live training. Most Americans don't wake up and think, I need to figure out how to connect more with veterans. So it's really, you don't know you need it until you actually need to have it. So I had this idea about building online videos where you could have best-in-class content, make it really engaging, and put it out there for free. So I say we're a public library. We now have over 160 courses in 7 different verticals. We train employers, and yesterday, as you mentioned, Vic had Patrick and I over at BMO Harris to do and several of you were there, to talk about veteran employment, but we do a lot in that space. We do a lot in the healthcare space. Caregivers and families, we just are about to announce that the American Bar Association is sponsoring us to build out a new school for legal professionals, and we train educators, higher ed, K through 12, volunteers, nonprofits, financial counselors. So we're really in all the touch points around the veteran, but we don't train the veteran themselves. So we're really the the organization that's training the average American. So I hope that helps answer the question, but.
It does. Mr. Kennedy, to distinguish yourself from the other Patrick, if I say Patrick. Estimated 2/3 of veterans get their mental health care outside of the VA. A lot of it through their employers if they're already employed. So what's the implications for parity when you have 2/3 of these people? And when we talk veterans, you know, it's not only veterans coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan, it's my age guys and gals too, you know, so what's the implications for parity when you have people who get their health care throughout, not from the VA?
So just to give a recap, the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act says that mental health ought to be included and reimbursed the same as the rest of physical medicine, that it's long past time that we include health, meaning mental health too, not something separate, carved out. That's what mental health has been. Carved out and pushed down the hallway and reimbursed at a fraction of the level that the rest of medicine is reimbursed. That's where we are. And according to a report by Millman, which for those of you who don't know is one of these fancy-dancy accounting firms that all of the big healthcare companies use to do their data analysis, Millman came out with the most scathing report on the adherence of insurance companies to the mental health parity law over the course of the last several years, to the point where it is once again obvious that they're not obeying the federal law that says that they must have equal coverage, whether you're inpatient, in-network, outpatient, in-network, inpatient, out-of-network, outpatient, out-of-network, need pharmacy or ER benefits. They must be commensurate with the rest of physical medicine. That's not a radical idea. And in spite of the fact that this is such a big public health crisis, they're still ignoring not only their obligations to medicine, because we know taking care of the whole person reduces total cost of care. By the way, all the analytics firms say this is the best way to save money in total cost of care, is address the mental health issues that are often comorbid to other physical health conditions, but are not recognized because our medical system does not understand nor recognize these issues, period. Talk about cultural changes. And so veterans are losing out the most when they're working for a big company, but that big company does not know how to purchase their medical benefits. Because guess what? The people to blame here are not just Anthem, United, Aetna, Humana, Cigna. The people to blame are the very companies that are hiring them to do their third-party administration of their health benefits. So what we need to do is set up a certification program where companies can now say, I can guarantee that my employees will have equal access, will not have to wait 10 times as long to get the appropriate inpatient or outpatient intensive care that I need for my illness or that of my family member, which is currently the status quo right now. Because businesses should not want to sign on to these companies and have them deny so many benefits to their employees. It's not good for business. And yet, you know, you kind of wake up and you say, are we not in huge denial that this is still going on and it's permissible? Veterans are tragically victims of this because they've served their country, and because they come home and they suit up and show up and they look pretty good, well, things must be all right. But we know about post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury that often these invisible wounds of war manifest themselves years after a veteran returns, when they're
charging along in their job, and all of a sudden something happens and everything else comes cascading down on them. And at that moment, if they can't call their employee assistance program and also get referred to the appropriate health benefits within their place of employment, it's on that employer and it's on all of us that they can't get the benefits that they need to treat their invisible wounds of war. And that's why parity enforcement is so important to ensuring patriots get the necessary coverage for their invisible wounds of war.
Thank you. Mr. Undersecretary, I've got a manpower question for you. It's my understanding that with our all-volunteer forces that we're, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I may not be up to date, that we're sending our troops back to serve 2, 3, 4, or even more tours of duty into a combat zone in our long-running war on terror, which to me is unbelievable. After spending a year in Vietnam, I couldn't imagine going back. Each time that we send our troops back, aren't we putting them in greater jeopardy for post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, and the like? Is this sustainable? Can we keep doing this? Can we keep sending these people back and keeping them in the service? Particularly the middle management of the officer corps, you know, the first lieutenants, captains, majors, you know. Can we keep doing this? Is this in the national interest?
There's no doubt that it's a crisis and that readiness is our number one priority as far as the military, but there's no doubt that every one of the services is at a breaking point. I mean, you have to remember, Paul, the differences between, you know, your war in Vietnam and World War II. In World War II, 10% of the population served. So in politics, you say demographics are destiny. So you could be the most dynamic Patrick Kennedy in the world, but if he's running as a Democrat in Wyoming, he's not going to win because it's a Republican state. No offense, Patrick, you're great. I don't mean it. But the demographics of the country, so 10% served in World War II, 16 million Americans. Vietnam, 5.5 million Americans. And this war, it's less than 1% that have served in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, and Paul, a little side note, I will tell you that when your generation came back from Vietnam, our nation, our society had a hard time separating the war from the warrior. And people forgot that it's not the warriors that choose to go to places like Vietnam or Baghdad or Kabul, it's the policymakers of our nation. And of any generation that should have been salty and not welcomed my generation home, it was the Vietnam generation. But I will tell you, Paul, on behalf of your generation, you've bent over backwards to say, welcome home, brother, welcome home, sister, to our Iraq, Afghanistan brothers, and has made our transition that much easier. So thank you for your service. So let's just, I'm a numbers guy, so follow the numbers. So you just heard me say less than 1% are currently serving the longest wars in American history. We're 16 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have asked that less than 1%, this warrior class of America, to go on these multiple deployments time and time again. Again, most of the time it's their decision to whether or not they do one deployment and they usually re-enlist, et cetera. But still, when you look at that and you look under the hood of who's doing this service, 79% of our recruits come from our current military families. So current military families, you know, I've done 2 deployments, my brother's done 2 deployments, my dad served during Vietnam, my 2 uncles served in Vietnam, et cetera. But the point is that we're asking a whole heck of a lot of this warrior class. And then when you dial down in current military families of those who are serving, about half say that they would not recommend military service to their sons and daughters because of the strain. So that is why this issue of the invisible wounds of war is such a critical national security issue of wrapping our arms around post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury, and not just what it does for our veterans, but what that means for society. I will tell you that it's the American military that has been the leader of social change in America. When half of our country was still segregated during the Korean War, President Truman said, we're desegregating our military. And this is when we had white water fountains and colored water fountains. Okay? And he said, you all wear green. And we did it in the middle of a war. And when we came back and really World War II democratized education because of the because of then the original GI Bill, where then it was a rite of passage that you went on to college, and most GIs went to colleges. But you fast forward to, when Patrick and I served in Congress, that's why him and I fought so hard to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, because we kicked out 13,000 soldiers and troops not because of any misconduct, because of their sexual orientation. We changed that, which ushered in marriage equality in America, because when you looked at the deciding vote, which was Justice Kennedy, he specifically cited, well, Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal is out these soldiers. It's going to be harmful if we continue with discrimination within states and out. So you look at the next fight, in my opinion, and it really is using veterans as that agent for social change, and not using them in a bad way, using them in a way that they want to serve and they want to show. It breaks our heart that we know that every single day in America, 20 veterans will commit suicide, and 2 will commit suicide when they're in active service. So it's 22 a day. And it breaks our heart, as Patrick mentioned, that 70% of our troops, when they come home, don't go and don't have VA services. It's not like a life-living grant. You serve and, basically you get on and off for 5 years. But a lot of times at VA, that local VA hospital in places like Chicago, which is a great VA, well, if you're in another part of Illinois where it's 2-3 hours away, it's so hard to go to an appointment and then come back the next day when you have a job and et cetera, et cetera. So that's why this issue is so critically important for our national security in America and for the warrior class of America, and make sure that we wrap our arms around this and move the ball forward when it comes to mental health parity, and make sure that we have a level playing field.
Thank you. Marjorie, I understand that the VA is instituting a suicide prevention initiative called SAVE, which will require every VA employee, from the custodian staff to the secretary of the VA, to get SAVE trained. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And I have to tell you, every time I go into the VA for my annual physical, or even just to pick up a prescription, either here in Chicago or in North Carolina, where I live part-time, certainly in the winter, the first question is, are you under any stress? Have you had any suicide? I mean, they screen you when you pick up your prescription. So the VA is very conscious of these issues. But tell us about the SAVE program and what it intends to do.
So I'm actually going to read this, because if I don't, I'll screw it up and somebody will get me in trouble. But I think it's good because you'll walk away with some tips. But SAVE is an interesting program because it is some basic facts about suicide. And, and I know you mentioned that the Suicide Foundation people are here. Suicide is an American crisis right now. People are taking their lives, and I love how Patrick mentioned this continuum between overdose and suicide. And I think if you don't write a note, and you're not actively pursuing the end of your life, that it isn't considered suicide. But what about all that destructive behavior that happens? Abuse, reckless behavior. If I took a bottle of pills and drank a bottle of Jack Daniels and drove my car into a wall, I mean, is that suicide? And I think these are some bigger discussions about what really constitutes suicide and ending someone's life, or these awful acts of homicidal behavior where we're having people killing, what happened in Vegas, and those are also suicide attempts when you're just taking other people with you. So there's a big effort on how do you break that down? How do you get, as in the military they say, to the left of the boom? How do you get to a place where you reach someone before they get to that other end? And the SAVE has these basic 4 questions. And by the way, I didn't mention this before, but all the PsychArmor courses are free. So we are building SAVE for the VA. It's a big deal for the VA. and Secretary Shulkin says it all the time, because suicide's one of his initiatives, that every single VA employee, from the janitor to the secretary, will be required in 2018 to take the SAVE course. It's about a 20-minute course. Also, any of you that want to take it can take it. But I'll go through it really, really quickly. It's these 4 questions. The first one is that asking about suicidal thoughts or plans may lead someone to take their own lives. True or false? What do you think? That's right. That's not true. And I'm not going to go through the details of it, but a lot of people actually believe that. They think if I said to you, are you going to commit suicide or are you going to take your life, that now I planted a seed. Number 2, there are talkers and there are doers. True or false? False. So that's another one of these myths that a lot of research has shown, is that just because someone has talked about it and threatened it and has had some failed attempts doesn't mean that they wouldn't actually go through with it. Number 3, if someone really wants to die by suicide, there's nothing any of us can do about it. That's exactly right. And we also have another course that Dr. Craig Bryant, who's one of the lead suicidologists in Utah, did. It's really good. It's called Helping Others Hold On, that you can take as well. It is in our healthcare provider school. And we also have one from him in our nonprofit and volunteers. But that one, he does a really good job explaining that people that are suicidal, they go back and forth between this ambivalence of wanting to live and wanting to die. And that even when you'll hear from people that have attempted suicide and have lived through it, they'll tell you even in those last seconds, they go back and forth. They call it like a seesaw. And the last question on SAVE is, a person won't die by suicide if they just made plans for a vacation, they have young kids at home, they make a verbal or a written promise to you, or they know how much they're loved. False. And so SAVE stands for, S is for signs, A is for ask, V is validate, that you really want to make sure you're validating someone's feelings, and then E is to encourage them to get help.
Marjorie, among your many talents and skills, you're a licensed marital and family counselor as well. And we know that families serve as well as active duty troops and veterans. They just serve at home. What stressors have you found in families with active duty military or veterans, and what programs are available for them to help with these stressful situations?
It's an excellent question, because I think this is where the military and veterans are so different than average civilians, in the sense that families really do serve. And their whole existence is so unbelievably different than mine is, or those of us that don't serve. And if you think about it, and I don't mean to be stereotypical, but let's just say if it's a male service member, that spouse now, as he goes to these deployments back and forth, is alone, 6 months, 9 months, single parenting. They come back, that person may not be the same as when they left, right? So there's so many issues. We have a big initiative right now for caregivers, and PsychArmor has, I think, 33 courses for caregivers. It is the most difficult population for us to reach, and it's because people don't identify as a caregiver. You just think to yourself, well, I'm just a spouse. I'm just that person's wife or husband, or it's my parent, or it's my kid. I would just do this. And then if you think about it, once you do identify as a caregiver, that's a very daunting identity to now own, because now it feels really permanent. Now it could feel like, wow, I am now caretaking for this person for a really long time. And so I think we as a culture also really need to think about, we're always going to be caregivers. We're always going to be families. And whether we're serving or not, our service members and our veterans have it even worse, but we have to figure out a way to really look at and appreciate the stress that it puts on families. You know, we don't, when we talk about suicide, we talk about the 20 veterans a day. We don't talk about the caregivers and the spouses that are taking their lives at 2/3 that rate. So, I mean, there is tremendous stress, and the family needs to be included in when we talk about mental health. Always that caregiver, that spouse, should be in the room, but we have a lot of great resources, so I'll do another PsychArmor plug. Check out the caregiver courses.
Thanks. I have a final question for all of you. And you can decide amongst yourselves who wants to tackle this first. The media overwhelmingly portrays veterans as broken. Hollywood only adds to that narrative. Yet there's a considerable body of a posteriori empirically derived data. I'm reflecting my Jesuit education now, 4 years of Latin, 4 years of Greek, out there. The Edelman surveys, is John Edelman here? He's done wonderful work at veterans. The Edelman surveys point this out, that the broken veteran narrative is actually hindering veterans from getting jobs. So how do we balance the conversation? How do we say to potential employers and the general public that correlation does not equal causation, that just because you served doesn't make you a killer, you know, when you come home? How do we say that veterans bring great skills to the workplace and to their communities, yet at the same time keep up the awareness and visibility for veterans who do actually need the resources necessary to help them? How do we focus on post-deployment growth as well as post-traumatic stress?
Sure. That's a very interesting question, Paul. So a couple things on the media front. There are a victimization of our veterans, and some for fundraising dollars. There used to be commercials that basically created, I felt like, veterans with lost puppies and dogs, and I think that organization has changed their ways and have been much more positive, which I appreciate. I was publicly critical of them, which is why I do think, it's why I'm on the board of PsychArmor, because they don't ask individuals for money. They get corporate sponsors and other money to do their free programs. So there's no doubt. I mean, I just worked on a Hollywood movie. It was a Spielberg movie called Thank You for Your Service. Miles Teller was in it. Miles Teller was in it. Amy Schumer, which talked about these 4 soldiers from the Big Red One coming home from Iraq, and unfortunately, in the beginning of the movie, one of the soldiers had committed suicide. But it was really a story about brotherhood and how they made it through. It was very, very powerful. I know PsychArmor was a big supporter of getting more eyeballs on it. And then other roles, I just did a documentary called Almost Sunrise, where it was produced that one, where it was 2 soldiers walking across the country and dealing with moral injury of seeing the face of evil in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and them dealing with it back at home. So when I look at this, it really is a two-sided coin, because the majority of our, all of our veterans are leaders of character. All of our veterans are civic assets. They're actually more likely to be employed than non-veterans. They're more likely to start a small business than non-veterans, and for that small business to be successful. They're more likely to vote in elections no matter what their political persuasion is. They're more likely to be Little League coaches and pastors in their churches. And they're also more likely to be C-suite executives and entrepreneurs. I mean, you look at some of the most iconic brands in America were started by veterans. So the largest healthcare company in the world is Johnson & Johnson, started by a veteran, now run by a veteran. You look at Nike shoes, the largest sports apparel company, started by Bill Bowerman, which was Phil Knight's track coach. You look at FedEx, Walmart, Wendy's, go on and on. And that's positive. Verizon is run by a Navy veteran. So Comcast, largest media company in the world, started by a Navy veteran. It's Army-Navy week, so I'm trying to be bipartisan, even though I'm pro-Army, to my Navy colleagues. But you can't just say, okay, everything is fine. you have to be honest about our folks who are falling through the cracks. And we have an ethic that we leave no one behind. And that's why what Patrick and Marjorie are doing is so critically important. And when you look at the higher rate of suicides with veterans and with caregivers, that means that the 99% of folks who aren't serving today need to be part of that solution. And it's not just, oh, well, it's a veteran issue. It's a major deal. And we have to stay on top of it. I mean, I was reading the paper this morning, early on. I mean, they just cut about $500 million from veterans homelessness. And that was where we made a lot of gains. It just was quietly just, they didn't announce it, of course, but they just did it. And that's gonna hurt. That's gonna hurt our community of 20 million American veterans out there. And those who are falling through the cracks and those who are most in need. So it's a balancing act, Paul, so I want to be honest that, I tried my best to highlight some great stories of brotherhood and point to, great business leaders and great veterans that are doing phenomenal things, people like Seth Moulton and Tulsi Gabbard in the Congress. But you also have to acknowledge the fact that there are too many of our brothers and sisters who are falling through the cracks and ultimately taking their own lives in their own hands.
Anybody else?
I mean, I'll add in, and we talked about this quite a bit yesterday, we have what we call the military-civilian divide. And it is such a big divide that civilians who we would consider anybody who's not a military veteran don't even acknowledge themselves as civilians. I mean, how many of you in here that would consider yourself a civilian? So, I mean, I laugh at just how much that divide exists. We don't even know what to call somebody who is not a military veteran, because we did a survey, an informal survey, unlike what John would do, which was asking, what does a civilian mean to you? And that's actually, people think it's someone who works on base but not in uniform. So our divide is so big, and part of the problem is average Americans either make the veteran into a hero, so we have that kind of warrior, or they're broken. And then on the other side of it, we have veterans who basically stay together, and that kind of birds of a feather flock together, and they are in conversations amongst themselves all the time, and they don't realize what people think of them. So they're these two really, really separate worlds. And I have the bizarre place of working both in mental health and healthcare and employment. And I'll tell you, when we talk about PTS, we talk about post-traumatic growth for employers. But when we're talking to healthcare providers, we're talking about PTSD and, treatment options around that. And a big part of that is trying to change the way that Americans and employers look at veterans when we're trying to get veterans into jobs and getting them into good jobs and jobs that they can excel in. And that creates a whole effort, and a lot of people, and Patrick Murphy's very involved in that movement too, which is educating employers on the great strengths that veterans bring. But this narrative that the movies and that, the average American often thinks of the veteran as broken, it hurts.
I don't know how to wrap up other than to say it's amazing the different culture, when you're talking about different cultures, to the culture that you grew up with, I grew up with, where the ideal was how you could give back to your country. All of us have impulses, we want to succeed, but part of our definition as to who we are is how much do we do for our country. It's shocking that level of sacrifice that is exhibited so widely by our veterans community is slapped in the face by a current culture that is putting more value on a transnational corporation than providing the necessary funding for homeless veterans. You can't make that up, in my view. Can't make that up. And so all I can say is thank you all for being part of this, because this civic experiment in democracy, which our veterans have fought and died for, is still an experiment. There's no guarantee that this great country of ours that we know and love right now, how it goes forwards, that it is inevitable, that it's going to always be a country which promotes freedom, tolerance, democracy, all the things that we cherish that our veterans suffered and died for. So part of our obligations to veterans is not only to help them, but help the cause that they sacrificed for. And we don't do that by ignoring the values of our democracy that they gave their lives for. And that civic quality that if anybody has ever had the chance to be amongst veterans, see it up close and be inspired by it, you'd say the world that we're living in today in this country is antithetical to that culture of service to others. And speaking of service to others, again, thank you, Paul, for your service today and helping coordinate this. And thank you to the sponsors once again for helping to sponsor this. There's nothing out there right now that will automatically ensure that this kind of cultural dialogue as to where we are in our healthcare system and our employment system and our society is going to happen on its own. So the Kennedy Forum is trying to advocate up in Springfield and in the city of Chicago for that culture change. And if you look at our accomplishments, they're extraordinary. Training the police force and being sensitive to those with mental illness, changing our insurance approach and how we contract with our MCOs in the state for coverage for mental health and addiction. None of that would have happened on its own if it weren't for the team that was sent up there, that was sponsored because of your support for the Kennedy Forum. So this isn't just a nice conversation this morning. I'm telling you, your support today is civic action. Okay? This is our duty to do something for our community. I want you to think of it as such. I named this thing the Kennedy Forum, not the Patrick Kennedy Forum. Although my ego, I would have loved, can we squeeze in Patrick right in front of... But listen, I was by dint of birth, this was an accident of fate. I had this last name. It's a powerful name that I think embodies a lot of the ideals that we're trying to express through the activities of this forum, which I am grateful for you to support. And I ask you for your continued support. If you look at our program for our January 16th program, off the charts for Chicago. I mean, what a dialogue. Axelrod, Arnie Duncan, Common, Michael Phelps. I asked Kara, my assistant, how many gold medals does Michael Phelps have? Does anyone know? Because we have to promote this guy. He's coming to our forum. So I need you all to get the word out, okay? It's not a done deal. It's a great forum. It's going to be great, but I really need you to go the extra mile to make sure people are present and help us with that. So please, thank you for your help today, but we need your help for tomorrow, too, for January 16th.
Thank you, Patrick. We have time for one or two questions from the audience. So, go ahead.
Thank you all so much for being here and presenting your views today. I happen to be a doctor of clinical psych who specializes in military psych. I'm a graduate of Adler's program in doctoral military psych. And the great insight that I've drawn from my work with vets is how their service has taught them to very powerfully discern what's essential and what's not. And I can't think of a quality more essential to a society that is so distracted as that. And if I was going to say one thing about why our veterans are so important is because that's a quality we so desperately need. The founder of the program has on his wall a quote from Thucydides, the ancient Greek who chronicled the Peloponnesian War. He said, "A society that draws too great a distance between its scholars and its soldiers will have its children taught by cowards and its wars fought by fools." I cannot think of a more important prophecy for this country and its national security issues than that statement. And I just, Congressman Murphy, you've lived that truth. And Congressman Kennedy, you are such a powerful advocate of the truth. And Ms. Morrison, you've been working shoulder to shoulder and face to face with this population. I wanted just to draw out a little bit more of your sense of that urgency of that civilian-military gap. Thank you.
first, thanks for your service in our space and your leadership. Appreciate it. And I've read that quote. It is really powerful. But as a former West Point professor, and I actually taught at U Chicago with Axelrod, I don't ever want to call professors cowards because then they might not hire me again. So, but I agree. I mean, it's the whole Athens and Sparta. I mean, I'm the chair of innovation up at West Point, and I think the beauty of West Point, in my opinion, is not only do we draw these 4,000 young Americans from every congressional district in every part of America, but every cadet is a scholar and every cadet is an athlete, whether they play Division I sport or a club sport. But we actually have more Rhodes and Oxford scholars than any other institution in America beside Stanford and Harvard right now. So it's a sense of pride that we're the perfect blend of Athens and Sparta. We feel like in America. But I worry, you heard me earlier, when the demographics are destiny, I worry about the trends that you're mentioning. I worry about things like screen time and you look at, I say 79% of folks that join our ranks come from military families. Only 30% of Americans could even come in the military, mostly because of obesity. And, you know, it goes to that screen time. So I'm working a couple things on that, but I think it all goes hand in glove on the issues that we're all trying to deal with and really champion on behalf of our great nation.
I'll just say on the insight, I was with someone the other day in the Senate who said, I don't know why I'm serving in the Senate. It's turned into the House. And I didn't know I didn't know whether to say, you know, screw you or I'm sorry for you. But that's not the way the Senate was designed to be, this thin majority only. It's never supposed to be the saucer that hold the hot teacup of national temper and passion. Right now, they went on to say that, you know, there's going to be no military that can defeat this country. There's going to be no economy that can defeat our economy. I mean, we're still the greatest in the world and will continue to be. But we're going to kill ourselves from within by handing the keys to our nation's greatness over to someone else because we're ignoring our mental health and addiction as a nation. It's going to eat us up from within. It is the enemy within. And I thought profound because it goes directly to your point that we're losing insight that our strength as a nation is our people. And that's what makes a military strong, are the quality and character of that cohort of individuals that fight as a team. And you got to be as strong as the weakest link. And we as a nation, if we're considering all of our fellows as part of our team, have a lot to do to shore up the weakest link because we're in jeopardy of losing it, in my view, as a nation because we're not paying attention and minding the store of our own strength as a nation.
Take one more. Go ahead.
Thank you all for your work and for your heroism in your respective ways. Ms. Morrison, you made brief reference to the PTS versus PTSD, a case where there actually is something in a name and that a single letter can mean a lot by its presence or absence and what it confers or implies. Could any or all of you speak to that specifically?
Yeah, I will. The problem with it is that when you go in to get mental health care, you go to see your provider, the only way that insurance is going to cover it is if you have a diagnosis, right? Just like if you go to your primary care doctor and you get like a strep test. So you need the D because the D is the diagnosis that the insurance will reimburse you for. So in a sense, we're part of this broken system. So we can drop the D, which Patrick's good friend, General Pete Corelli, has been a big advocate of dropping the D. The problem with it is that now if I were to say to a veteran, it's not a disorder, this is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation, and I often think to myself, you know, people who are exposed to things, you want them to have a reaction. I mean, that's a healthy response, and it's the body's way of, you know, naturally dealing with something. But if we say drop the D and then they go in through counseling, it's not going to be covered without that D. So to me, I get a little frustrated with the conversation because we want to make sure that people go and get help, and then we want to make sure that they can afford their help, and if they have the benefits, going back to parity, that they should have through their insurance coverage, we have to keep the D. So sadly, I don't get to make the rules, but this is an ongoing debate. But until we figure out another way to cover these types of things, we have to keep the D.
I'll just say in terms of nomenclature, we're still in the phase of saying committed suicide, and our friends from American Foundation for Suicide Prevention always remind us it's complete suicide, because commit conveys that you're committing a crime. It's like it's an old-fashioned idea. Complete, this is not something that happens suddenly, and the reason why we can interrupt and save so many more Americans' lives who are suffering is that 90% of those who take their lives have been suffering from a diagnosable and a treatable mental illness. And because it hasn't been diagnosed and it's not treated, those are the folks that are often dying. That's why this is absolutely manageable, even though our common perception is when someone decides to take their life, well, there's nothing you can do about it. In fact, that's not supported by the evidence. So I appreciate that, because it is important as to why we have to be careful on what the language is. There's still so much to wade through on this, but we're all on this journey together, and thank you again for being here this morning. I hope you all have a great, great day.
Thanks to all of these wonderful people, and it's been an honor for an old soldier like me to be with you this morning. It truly is. Mr. Chairman?
Thanks, Paul. And thanks, Paul, for keeping us on schedule. It's 9:26, so we're doing very well, even with Congressman Murphy coming in a few minutes late. Thank you for joining us. I'm Peter O'Brien, chairman of the Kennedy Forum, Illinois. And if I could ask all of my board members and leadership members to please stand. On behalf of all of the Kennedy Forum of Illinois, Patrick, this is the Kennedy Forum of Illinois. Together as a team, we are breaking stigma and bringing parity to Illinois and the nation. On behalf of our board members and our leadership council, I want to thank all of the veterans, all the generations of veterans that are here present today, young and old, who have fought for us in our country's wars and continue to fight the stigma and fight for parity for mental health in our system. So thank you very much, veterans. It is your initiatives, it is your leadership that we take as our passion and our efforts to go forward. So thank you, veterans. And the most important veteran here today, Paul Dillon. Paul, thank you very much. And to all of our speakers, Congressman Murphy, thank you for making your way here and lending so much. Marjorie Morrison, thank you for bringing your friend Patrick Kennedy to Illinois. And Patrick, it's your message, it's your energy, it's your passion, it's your lived experience that you express to so many in this nation. And bringing your name to Illinois does make a difference. So thank you to Patrick Kennedy for leading it throughout the nation and the world. And I have some gifts for all of our speakers. I have some gifts that will keep us, keep you here in Illinois safe from the rain and from the snow that we may be having. You never know. So, James, do you want to help me? Don't be hitting anybody with this. No. There we go. So that's the shelter that you give us in the fight for mental health parity. That'll help you in the rain and snow here in Illinois. Thank you. Patrick has alluded to it. We have coming up the January 16th event, our 4th annual convening of the Kennedy Forum of Illinois. The Kennedy Forum His national convening is here in Illinois. We're very proud of that fact. It's been a tremendously run convening for 3 years now, going into our fourth, by our executive director, Kelly O'Brien. Kelly, please stand. And I've got to say, and I've said it many times, why we share the same last name. I met Kelly when we interviewed for this position, so we're not related. Kelly leads a great team. James Burns, David Lloyd, Kara Kafta, all of us at the Kennedy, so thank you. January 16th at the Chicago Hilton Hotel on South Michigan Avenue. We're going to have some great speakers. Honorable Arnie Duncan, Michael Phelps, 28-time Olympic medalist, Patrick. Common, our hip-hop recording artist and actor, poet, and film producer will be with us as well. David Axelrod. David has been a supporter of the Kennedy Forum. David was a supporter of Patrick Kennedy so many years back, and when I went to him several years ago and said we wanted to form the board, David said, you know, well, I'm going to be doing this thing on CNN in the up-and-coming election, so I won't be able to spend some time, but I will when I can, and he is. He's a person of his word, and he's now going to be speaking with us at the January 16th event. Mark Holden, Tom Arnold, Susan Burton, so many. There's so many more. Please support this. This allows us to bring this message forward, to lessen and break stigma and promote parity within our nation and within the state of Illinois. Thank you all for being here today. We appreciate your efforts. Bring the word forward. The more we can talk about breaking stigma of mental health and addiction, the more we'll make a difference in our time. So thank you. Enjoy the day. Thank you to our speakers.